Thank you so much for coming back and staying till the last minute, hopefully. As you know, this is the fourth and final session Scott is going to deliver. And in this session, he's going to explore how the emergence of new technology is affecting English language teaching and learning. And he's also going to reduce language learning to 6 problems and evaluate the solutions that technology can offer for these problems. So, for the last time, please join me to welcome Scott and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Ada. And thank you once again, British Council, for sponsoring this trip. Can you hear me? Am I on? Yes. And for making it such a pleasure, and for all of you for being so enthusiastic, and for sacrificing this weekend for your professional development, which is really, really impressive. I want to talk about technology, educational technology now, and it sort of fits into the theme that we've been looking at, or the themes that have emerged over the course of this weekend. And again, I'll try and get to the point relatively quickly so we've got time for questions, not just about educational technology, but anything else that comes up that you have been burning to ask me. Okay, so I think we're pretty familiar with this kind of rhetoric. This is taken from a website, and I'm not going to give you the context just yet, but we're kind of familiar with the claims that are being made here. Technology holds great promise to transform teaching and learning. It allows for more personalized instruction, higher levels of student engagement, and instant assessment of student skills, giving educators real-time feedback so they can adjust their teaching as necessary. So this is very much part, as I say, of the sort of the positive rhetoric associated with technology, that it's a good thing. And it's going to make our lives easier, it's going to make learning more efficient, it's going to make assessment more efficient, and so on. But I don't think it's a new claim. In fact, if you look back at the history of educational technology, you'll find that similar claims were being made a long time ago. If you remember yesterday we were looking at some old textbooks for teaching English. The same kind of themes recur in the images associated with technology in education. This is not just language education, this is education generally. So you get something like this. This is from the 1920s, I think, or early 1930s, the uses of television, the possibilities of television as a medium for education. So there you have it. You have the professor in his university, always a man with a beard and a suit, and he's transmitting, he's giving the lecture, it's being transmitted by the television receiver to the students out in the boonies, as we call them. So they're getting the benefit of the professor's wisdom without having to leave home. That's the idea. So, I mean, that idea was instantly attractive to people who saw that the possibilities of television. And then, of course, those of you who are as old as I am will remember the language laboratory, which was in its time also heavily, there was a lot of investment, not just in terms of economic investment, but sort of theoretical investment in the value of learners sitting in little cubicles repeating things and getting feedback, either from the monitor, the teacher who's at the front of the room, or more recently getting feedback, automatic feedback from the program itself. So this is, we associate the language laboratory with audiolingual learning through repetitive pattern practice drills, etc. And they, in one form or another, still kind of exist. We'll look at some modern versions. I remember being trained to work in a language laboratory as a teacher when I first started training. So they were still around, but they didn't last much longer. They had gone by the time the communicative approach came into, or they were turned into self-access centers where students, you could go and listen and read at that, but not pattern practice. Nevertheless, they'd fulfilled a certain need that we mentioned yesterday, the fact that there is an element of repetition involved in language learning, but it's not necessarily the key. I remember when I first, at primary school, when I had my first French lesson, the teacher came in and she had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and this is in fact a record player, I mean a disc player, but this image would have been almost exactly the time when I first started learning French, where the teacher would play us recordings of Monsieur Dubois, Madame Dubois having breakfast together and talking about that kind of thing. And we thought this was so modern. So modern. And you can tell, look at them, the motivational effect of bringing the little piece of equipment into the room is very, very strong. I'll come back to that point. More recently still, I don't know whether you were this passed across your radar, but this was there was a period in the, when was it? Late 90s, early 2000s and noughties. The hype associated with these artificial digital online worlds. This one is called Second Life. Do you remember that? Second Life. So it was creating a kind of artificial world, and you could design it however you wanted to, and you created an avatar and you moved through it and you could interact, and people immediately saw the possibilities of using Second Life as an environment, a virtual environment for practicing or teaching languages, or actually having conferences about languages. And this was a conference I attended in Second Life. So I'm sitting at home, my avatar is sitting in there, somebody's giving a talk which is being beamed in real time to us with the PowerPoint slides and everything. And it is kind of quite powerful, the fact that you could recreate this environment. Second Life, I think it's sort of second death now. I mean, I don't think it exists anymore, does it? I don't think it's, it became far too complicated and cumbersome and et cetera. But there was an enormous amount of enthusiasm generated when it first came out. It was going to be the best thing since whatever had just been before in terms of delivering language learning opportunities to learners. And so this pattern seems to recur again and again and again, where some new technology comes into play. Immediately educators see its possibilities, its potential. There's an enormous amount of enthusiasm, and then it sort of disappears, and another one comes in, and these waves of enthusiasm, such that one critic of educational technology has said, calls it the cycle of hype, hope, and disappointment. Hype meaning something being overly promoted. Hope and disappointment. It's perhaps the biggest lesson to be learned from the 20th century in terms of educational technology. And the same writer calls this phenomenon of the hype phenomenon, he calls it techno-fundamentalism. A straightforward enchantment with technology and a desire to benefit from continued technological progress. So this is not just in education, this is in everything. Techno-fundamentalists believe that all of our problems can be solved by technology, including global warming, including conflicts, including whatever. And of course, education being one of those. And I'm not saying that at this point that I'm not a techno-fundamentalist, but I'm not saying I'm necessarily contrary to the position, but I can see some problems here, and that's what I want to explore. And it's interesting that yesterday I showed you the adjectives which most commonly collocate with the word method, remember? New, scientific, exciting. You get very similar adjectives that collocate with technology. It's always the most frequent one is new. New technology. Technology is almost by definition new. It's modern, it's high, it's advanced, it's digital, and so on. There's a few negatives in there like nuclear, but latest and so on. But there's a lot of positive associations with the term technology, and we kind of, these positive associations, we can't help, I think, being affected by them. There's a danger, I think, that we think technology, because it's new, is therefore good. And it's not necessarily the case, as we all know, that the new things are good, or that technological things are necessarily good. And if you go back in our own field in second language learning, looking at the attitudes towards technology, you'll find they kind of fluctuate. Now, this way back in 1966, Pitt Corder, one of the earliest applied linguists working at the University of Edinburgh, said the use of mechanical aids in the classroom is justified only if they can do something which the teacher unaided cannot do or can do less effectively. I think we need to kind of pause and think about that. And remember, he was writing in 1966, so he's writing mechanical aids then. What were they? I mean, they were very, very, very unsophisticated compared to what we've got now. And they really were things like tape recorders and film strips. But I think that's really, it's almost all I need to say. I think it's captured in that quotation. So it reminds us again that a lot of the wisdom from the mid part of the last century is still, I think, as wise as it was now. What's changed is the technology on the one hand, but also I think that enthusiasm for technology has been ramped up proportionally. Going back to my own trajectory, if you like, in language teaching, this was a very important book, Wilger Rivers, Teaching Foreign Language Skills. This is the second edition, came out in the 1980s. And what Wilger Rivers was able to do, she sort of anticipated the fact that the audiolingual approach and all the stuff that went with it, like language laboratories, maybe its days were numbered. And she was one of these prescient methodologists who could see the communicative approach on the horizon. And she's very interesting on the language laboratory. She has a chapter in that book called Has the Language Learning Laboratory Failed? And this was in 1981. Has it failed? And her feeling was, yes, it had failed, and for a number of reasons. And I'm not going to quote all the reasons, but one of the things that she observed in this chapter was she said, before requesting or rejecting expensive equipment, teachers should analyze what the expensive equipment does, which makes it effective as an aid to language learning. And then study less costly ways of doing the same thing. Yeah? So she's looking at it from an economic perspective, and it's something which is often ignored. And then she adds, above all, we must be able to demonstrate in a convincing way through improved student learning that the cost of the equipment is justified. And the costs are not just in terms of how much the equipment costs. The costs are ecological. These are dumped computers in various parts of the world. Americans alone discard 100 million computers, cell phones, and related devices every year. And it takes roughly 1.8 tons of raw material to produce one personal computer and its monitor. So you think about, we're talking about costs here that are not simply monetary costs, they're economic, they're ecological, and they're global. So I think these are the questions we need to be asking when we're confronted by anybody who comes with a little bit of a gadget, a new piece of equipment or whatever, and say, well, what does it cost? Not just what it's going to cost me or my institution, what's it costing the world, and what does it do better than I can do? And is there anything that can do it cheaper? And that's the question we should be asking anybody who comes to your, knocking on your door, selling you an interactive whiteboard, for example, or a whole lot of tablets, interactive whiteboard, or gaming equipment. What does it cost? Now, there was a wonderful educationalist, actually on the subject of whiteboards, there was a project in Mexico a few years ago to introduce interactive, you know what an interactive whiteboard is, right? Interactive whiteboards into the primary schools, and every primary school in Mexico. And you imagine, Mexico, enormous, and lots of primary schools. Terrible education system. I mean, getting very, very bad results. So they decided they could solve the problem by putting an interactive whiteboard into every primary school in Mexico. Now, an interactive whiteboard in those days cost about the same price as a small family car. They put interactive whiteboards into schools which still weren't connected to the electrical system. So they had to install satellite, solar panels to be able to run the interactive whiteboards. This cost millions, millions and millions and millions and millions. Most of those interactive whiteboards were never turned on. They just sat mouldering in rooms. The teachers didn't have the software to use them. They didn't have the expertise to use them. A study done by the University of Harvard went out a few years later to see the effect of that. It is a massive, massive waste of money. The money that could have been spent on training teachers or just fitting out the school with print books, libraries. And yet nobody, as far as I know, ever was made answerable for that decision. So I think this is the sort of things that we need to be addressing. And a person who addressed this many years ago is a wonderful educationist called Neil Postman, who was a personal hero of mine, who wrote a number of books criticizing educational policy in general, particularly in the United States, but I think, and not just, this is mainstream education, not just language education. And his question, he said, you have to ask of any technology is, what is the problem for which this is the solution? What is the problem? So, for example, with interactive whiteboards, what's the problem that interactive whiteboards are solving? Can anybody tell me? What's the problem that they can't already, a blackboard can't solve? Or a computer screen, a computer connected to a screen can't solve? So that's the question. When you're looking at the costs, and so this is, and I don't think that question has gone away. What is the problem to which this... Sorry? Well, okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned that, because let's look at the possible problems for which technology, the problems that we face, for which technology could be a solution. And I've listed 4 problems. If you're teaching a language, you've got to provide some kind of input. Learners need to be exposed to the language, yeah? So that's a challenge. That's a problem. That's what I call the input problem. They also need to be able to produce the language. So we need to be able to provide conditions in which learners are writing and speaking the language. So that's the output problem. But it's not enough just input and output. With the communicative approach particularly, they need to be interacting in the language. So that's what I call the interaction problem. And finally, they need, your point, they need feedback. You can't learn a language without getting feedback. You can't learn any skill without getting feedback. So we need to be able to provide optimal feedback to learners. So let's look at the technology then. See how does technology help us with each of these problems? And does it do it any better than existing means? Yeah? You with me? So what is the input problem for which this technology is a solution? Now, input, it seems to me, is the area that has most benefited from technology. When I first started teaching, I told you, we couldn't even get, we had one Time magazine for the whole of the school. We couldn't get sets of anything. They were so expensive. We couldn't get authentic material in Egypt for our students. We had to write all our own material. Even the course books were, years out of date by the time we got them. The listening material, I remember carrying from room to room a reel-to-reel recorder just to play listen. In the end, you didn't bother. You just read the dialogue from the book. Then we got cassette recorders. Things got a little bit easier, etc. But providing input was a serious problem. And I think this is the one particular area that we've benefited enormously from technology. So you've got websites like this. Do you know the ELLO? Listening material. Fantastic. Authentic, unscripted dialogues and monologues by native speakers and non-native speakers, conversations, very short, well recorded, with transcripts and index for topics and level. Wow, that's fantastic. If only we'd had that when we were teaching in Egypt, for example, so we could expose them to genuine listening material. It's listening, it's not video, it's audio. Oh yes, they do have videos, recent videos, there you go. That's the kind of thing I think we've really benefited from. Not only in the classroom, but of course outside the classroom. Students have access to this kind of thing at home. And that's the other thing, I think, was perhaps there's another problem that I haven't listed, which is the extramural, extracurricular problem. How do you get, or homework problem, if you like, how do you get learners working outside of the classroom? And this is the kind of thing, but of course it's not just this. There's the masses of stuff on the internet, the YouTube, the blah, 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 so there's no shortage of input. Actually, there's too much input. The problem is sifting through it, or helping the learners sift through it so they can find the kind of input which is ideal for them. What we need is search engines which are sensitive to level. Yeah, so you can say, I want a reading text about whales, I mean the animal, do they fly? No, they swim, that is pitched at B1 level. Wouldn't that be great if you had a search engine? Is there such a thing? There was briefly, and it disappeared. There wasn't, but if you could just say Wales B1, 100-word text or whatever, fantastic, what a resource. Somebody should design it. But that, because otherwise you've just got too much information. You know that Wikipedia, there's a simple Wikipedia. It's a simplified version of Wikipedia for learners or non-proficient. That's an excellent resource too. So this is the kind of thing that I'm very grateful for. Nevertheless, we need to be cautious about learners only ever accessing material online. There is a danger that with reading material particularly, the level of engagement with material online doesn't seem to be as deep as it is with print material. That if you read something on a website, there's a tendency to skim and scan rather than to read in detail. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but studies of, or critical studies of internet-mediated text suggest that although the offer is massive, there's a massive amount of it, but it is a low level of engagement. Unless we really need to find some particular piece of information, we tend to do what I do every day. The first thing of the day is look at the various websites, news websites of the world, BBC, New York Times, scan, and I'm reading at a very superficial level until such time perhaps as something attracts my attention. And the same book, this book that came out a few years ago, critical of the kind of cognitive engagement involved in called it the shallows as opposed to the deeps, I suppose. He says it is possible to think deeply while surfing the net, just as it's possible to think shallowly while reading a book. But that's not the type of thinking the technology encourages and rewards. So this is my slight reservation. Now, we do need to be careful that if students are accessing all their reading material online, that they may not be engaging with it at a level of depth that is as good as. And it seems to be the case, too, that now studies are showing that when students write things in longhand, they remember them better than if they key them in on a keyboard. There's something about the physicality of writing. So it might be at our peril if we lost these basic literacy skills that have got us so far. So, I won't, too much to read, you see. The output problem. Okay, so what does technology do to help learners produce language that they can't do already in the classroom? They can indeed. They can record and listen to themselves. So there's a lot of recording has always been a really useful technique in language learning. It's not something that's new. Recording equipment has been around for a very long time. It's got more sophisticated, it's got more portable. But the basic idea of recording yourself for language learning purposes and for feedback is an excellent one. I'm not sure if in the classroom this kind of thing is actually very useful. This is how the language laboratory has metamorphosed, if you like, over time. So this is from a website which sells now language laboratories that you can set up in the classroom. And I was kind of intrigued by the promotional literature the Easy Lab provides the computer classroom with the tools which allow the teacher and students to communicate with each other orally. You see what they're doing? They're communicating with each other orally, but via the machine. And you wonder why they're not just talking to each other? What is the advantage of them communicating through the machine, I wonder? The headsets and microphones guarantee communication between everyone in the class. Well, so do sort of mouths and ears guarantee communication with the class. And that's not all. At all times, the teacher is, now we find, this is the small print, the teacher is in complete control over what happens in the classroom, thanks to an extensive set of supervision and computer management tools. So in other words, the students are controlled by the software which is in these things, and they're having to say things that are stimulated by the software. It's no different from the traditional language laboratory. But the idea that they're communicating with each other and that they're doing it any better than if they were just talking to each other is, of course, a nonsense. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that's heavily promoted. I hope it's not. But I see absolutely no value for it. On the other hand, the kinds of things that you can get students to do outside of the classroom, particularly in terms of oral production, like recording themselves, or written production, like keeping blogs, writing, maintaining a website and that kind of thing, have been enhanced by technology. But those are kind of more outside of the classroom things. And as I was saying yesterday, it seems to me the classroom is this very special space which we want to keep clear so that the social work of language use can carry on uninterrupted and unfiltered by either materials or unnecessary and possibly expensive technology. Yes, they can. That's cool. And as I say, they can do a lot of things, but I would say those solve the out-of-class problem. They don't necessarily solve the in-class problem. I don't see a lot of technological aids that actually solve what we already do in the class in terms of reading and in terms of writing and speaking.
It raises motivation, and they get those likes. It raises their.
Oh yes, and I'll good. I'm glad I've mentioned motivation. I'll come to motivation in a second. Okay, the interaction problem, again, it's related to the input and output. Students can interact perfectly well in the classroom using what they've always interacted with. I don't think bringing in tablets or mobile phones into the classroom so that they can phone each other or text each other in the classroom has any particular pedagogical value. Outside the classroom, yes, but in the classroom? I don't know. And the studies, again, of interaction between people using technology have thrown some doubt upon, again, the value or the depth of the interactivity. Technological interactivity does not guarantee an educational encounter. This is studies of people doing discussions, online discussions, doing projects, etc., about comparing their culture. So students in Germany, for example, communicating with students in the United States in both languages and constructing, doing a task. And they found that in this particular study that the quality of interaction was actually quite poor, and there wasn't a lot of repair or follow-up, etc. So again, we need to be careful. When people are not face-to-face, are they really interacting at a level, a degree which they would if they were? You know, I could have come, my suggestion, where's Ada? I mean, this is very expensive bringing me here, and I'm very grateful that the British Council has done this. It would have been a lot cheaper to just do a webinar. And some people are doing it as a webinar, but in real time. What would you have preferred? The webinar or the face-to-face?
Face-to-face. It's different. It's not the same. It's not the same.
That's why we do it.
Okay. The feedback problem. Now, as the lady over here mentioned, feedback is absolutely vital in language learning. We need to get feedback, and traditionally feedback is in the form of correction, and traditionally the person who corrects is the teacher. And teachers, as part of their battery of techniques, have learned how to do feedback and correction in ways which are non-threatening and very constructive on the whole. either instant correction or delayed correction, written correction, spoken correction, organizing peer correction, self-correction, etc. We're pretty good at doing that, and we do it sensitive to the different learners' levels and personalities. So we don't overcorrect a student who's very shy, but we may correct things that we know students have already got right before, and we might nudge them to correct themselves, etc. Now, technology, can that do that? Can it do it? Well, when you think about correction in technology, I think about sort of Microsoft Word programs, the way that they find your mistakes, your grammar mistakes, or your spelling mistakes. That's kind of fairly low-level correction. It's useful. I mean, I couldn't live without it because I'm such a terrible typist. So that kind of feedback is useful. I'm not sure in the classroom it's necessary. It's useful, maybe good outside the classroom. But most of the feedback that you get from technology is of this form. It's programmed into the machine. It's not sensitive to the individual learner, and it's right or wrong. And it's ray, or it's like you failed. It's very, very, very crude. All it does is tell you how many you got right and how many you got wrong. Now, anybody can do that. You can look at the answers at the back of the book. Or the teacher can do it. Or the students can work out. But this seems to me has taken over what's called the gamification, is it? The gamifying of a lot of apps, of language learning apps, turning them into games. Now, to get this kind of feedback, you have to be testing things which are either right or wrong. You can't be testing things which are half right or half wrong. How would you give somebody... Remember, this morning we looked at two speakers of English, the Russian and the Italian. How would a machine give them feedback? It took us a good 10, 20 minutes to agree on what the criteria were, let alone to agree on a grade for those things. How could a machine in 100 years be that precise in judging the level of fluency of those two speakers? Now, maybe one day they will, but it's not yet. It's not happening now, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. Who is the best judge of a student's fluency? The teacher. Who is the best person placed to give correction when it's needed, at the point of need? The teacher. This is something, because feedback requires the person who's been giving the feedback to know exactly it is what you were trying to say. They have to get inside your head. It's not a case of right or wrong. It's a case of, so somebody says, next week I'm going to Tunisia. And the teacher says, wow, was that planned or was this a spontaneous decision? I need to know what the context is to know whether it's going to is right there or will is right. The machine's not going to know that. So this is what we're particularly good at because we're human beings. We're constantly anticipating, predicting, and trying to put ourselves in the heads of the people we're talking to. And teachers do this in a very successful way. They're trained and experienced in doing it. So the correction we give is individualized, and it's contextualized, and it's situated. It's at the moment that it's needed. So I don't see at the moment that the technology is anywhere near helping us with this problem. I think, just to sum up, it's helping us enormously with the input problem, less so with the output problem in class, but maybe outside of class, less so with the interaction problem in class, but maybe outside of class, and not at all with the feedback problem. But there are other problems we've faced that are actually maybe more important. If you were here on Friday night or in the American University, remember I said maybe it's the fact that none of these things are really as important as motivation. So we've got another problem. The real problem we face as teachers is the motivation problem. And a lot of the literature on educational technology is about the motivational problem. That, remember me at school, French, when I was 8, the teacher brought in this, and we were so excited. This was going to help us learn French, and, you know, it could only be good because it was technology. Unfortunately, the motivational problem hasn't been shown to have long duration. It doesn't last. And in fact, teachers get more motivated by technology than their students do, because students are so used to technology that it's not a big deal when the teacher comes in with, oh, look at this, I've got this wonderful, look at, if I press this, it changes color. And the students are going, yeah, what else does it do? Does it make pizza? So I think, again, we have to be careful, and that, in fact, motivation, it may be demotivating a lot of the technology because it's so familiar and it's so non-human. It's becoming apparent, says another critic, that wired students use technology less to learn than to distract themselves from learning. And that's so easy. We see this constantly in our classes, unfortunately, where students do have access to online resources that a lot of the time they're not doing what they ought to be doing. They're looking at their Facebook page, they're checking their emails, they're doing this, that, and the other. It's too easy. I do it myself in conferences. I'm sitting in the back, I just quickly check my email. I bet some of you are doing it now. And the Chronicle of Higher Education a few years ago, which is a reputable journal on higher education, and this is way back 2009, one teacher started to notice that if he prohibited the use of the computers in the classroom, the concentration, attention, and general motivation improved. The students were less bored when there was less to distract them. I mean, I'm not saying that this is a reason alone for not using devices in the classroom, but you have to use them at your peril because it's very difficult to control how learners use them. And another startling fact was that a laboratory study showed that attention got worse if a cell phone is merely visible nearby. So if somebody's doing a task and the cell phone is just sitting there, they will be nervous that they may be getting a message, or there's something, a WhatsApp is coming through or about to come through. Take the thing out of the classroom and they can't have that. We had this conversation the other evening, Friday evening, we were talking about multitasking. The idea that this day and age, because of digital technology, we're all very good at doing lots of different things at the same time. No, we do lots of different things at the same time, but we're not necessarily very good at them. That's one reason why drivers are not allowed to talk on their phones. Why? Because multitasking doesn't work. Your attention is finite. You cannot allocate it to two tasks simultaneously and do both tasks well. And we were talking in the restaurant the other night, and I was saying how on the flight over from Barcelona, 6-hour flight with a stop in Kiev, I did some of the best work I have done in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Why? Because I wasn't online. I had some editing work to do. I did 6 solid hours of really purposeful, focused work on the plane because I wasn't online. The only thing to distract me was these trilingual messages coming all the time about buying cosmetics. Okay. So that's the motivation problem. I'm very skeptical about claims that are made that technology is inherently motivating. There's a sixth problem that we face with, and that is the data problem. I don't mean the input problem here, I mean the data problem. If you're learning anything, you need information. Now, if you're learning a language, you need information about the language. So what kind of information am I talking about? Like references. The references, grammar, dictionaries, thesauruses, corpora, that sort of thing. You need information about the language, the data. That's the sort of thing that traditionally in textbooks is at the back of the book, or you buy a separate grammar book, or you have a dictionary. Now, we all know that the online dictionaries are fantastic. You can not only find the meanings of the word, you can hear the word, you can get lots of different authentic examples. You've got not just dictionaries, you've got corpora, databases that you can search, and the students maybe could search them too. You've got grammar references, reputable ones, and you've got an enormous amount of rubbish. I mean, real rubbish, in terms of grammar particularly. Any Joe Blow can set up a website which is the 10 most important rules in grammar. And you look at them and they say, those are not. They're often about spelling, actually. They're nothing to do with grammar. There's a massive amount of rubbish out there, and it's very difficult for learners to sort the rubbish from the gold. So that's where we need to be able to help them to access the data. But the data problem is in a sense solved by technology. It's just, I use the internet constantly, not just for data about language, but of course Wikipedia, etc. Whatever I'm writing, I need to check facts. I used it to check facts about Armenia before I came here. So, and about the language, for example. That's fantastic that you can do that, and you can do that on your phone. But language, so digital technologies are perhaps more commonly used as an information tool than a learning tool. Now, there's a big difference between information and learning. Just having access to information doesn't mean to say you're learning, especially with a language, because we know that language is about using. It's a skill. It's not a knowledge base. You need some knowledge, but you've got to have practice with a skill. So it seems to me that's how, in a sense, educational technology has always been conceived as information transfer. So even way back using television, it was all about television to transfer information, but not to develop skills. And the fact of the matter is that education, and especially language education, is not the transmission of information. Remember the pictures I showed you yesterday, the teacher sitting at the top of the, with the dais and the studious students? That was the transfer of information. We know that language learning and education generally is not about transferring information, it's the training needed to make use of the information. And the operative word there is use. So technology must be judged on the ability to do that, to help us make use of information, not just to provide information. And again, one needs to ask, what does the technology do that we don't already do as well? And who is trying to persuade us that the technology is good for this? Now, this is the longer part of the quotation I showed you at the beginning. So all this hype about technology, but in too many classrooms, these elements aren't working together in a cohesive way. A number of factors are holding educators back from realizing technology's full potential. With the generous support of, here's the punchline, so it's a kind of promotional thing for actually people who make interactive whiteboards, we've assembled this collection of stories, etc. So this is simply to remind us that when anybody's making big claims about technology and its ability to help us use information, we need to follow the money. Who's telling me this? And what's their particular interest? What's in it for them, not just for me? So I think that's salutary. And actually, going back to Postman again, reinforcing that point, we should know that nothing in the history of technology tells us that technology is entirely neutral. There's always some interested party. And they're often the manufacturer or the software manufacturer, that not necessarily the stakeholders in the learning thing. We need to go back to, again, asking that same question, what is the problem for which this is the solution? So, just to summarize, this is old-fashioned technology, if you like. Remember, yesterday I got you to draw a triangle, the three things that are in the classroom, the teacher, the student, and the materials. And there you have it, beautifully represented and connected, exactly. It is connected because look at their joint attention. Follow the eyes. It's the triangle upside down, but it's the materials, but it's absolutely beautiful. Now, that teacher, to me, is doing everything that I haven't yet discovered technology can do as well. He's talking through the reading process with the boy by asking those kind of questions I talked about on day one, comprehending questions. But what does that word mean? What do you think this means? It's mediated learning. Now, no computer can do that. No computer can have that kind of intense relationship, because it's not just a cognitive relationship. It's not just a relationship of information flowing backwards and forwards. It's a physical relationship. Look how close they are. And they're both sharing the holding of the book. It's what's called embodied learning, learning that's taking place in people's bodies, not just in their minds. And it's that thing when we follow the words with our finger, or when we write with our hands. That's embodied learning. If you've ever done any calligraphy, you'll learn that calligraphy is all about not thinking it through, it's just feeling it, feeling the shape of the letter unravel. So this is something that humans are programmed to do in ways that machines are not yet able to do. Okay, so this is to sum up. A study was done in Europe a few years ago on the impact of technology in education, language learning. And one of the things that they concluded, that language learning particularly is intrinsically related to face-to-face communication. Because that's what language is originally, face-to-face. Of course, we use language on the phone, and we write letters, and we send emails, etc. But it started off as face-to-face communication. So the argument is it's perhaps best learned in a face-to-face environment. Now, that's not to say that it's always possible. I've worked on online language courses, and they've been very, very, very well received because people can't always go to language classes. I teach on an online master's program for my university. I'm teaching teachers, not language, but we do it online because they can't all come to Barcelona, or I can't go to Japan or whatever. So we are communicating using the internet, and that's fantastic. But in a sense, it's second best. I teach the same class as I teach online on site in the summer in New York, and everybody feels this is more fun. It's more expensive for everybody, but it's more fun. It's more engaging, it's face-to-face, it's hands-on, it's embodied. But, you know, second best is not third best. I mean, second best is good. If you can't have face-to-face learning, then the people watching me now are getting, I hope, some benefit from watching me if they haven't all turned off. They're probably checking their emails. And Claire Cramch says, talking about language learning compared to other subjects, is while classes in the curriculum, other classes like biology and math and whatever, history, activate mostly the brain, the language class engages the whole body, its emotions, feelings, desires, and projections. Again, just reinforcing the point that language is an embodied thing. It's not just information that we're transmitting, and therefore it needs to be, the learning of it theoretically should be embodied. A friend of mine is working in a project for the British Council in Uruguay, and you may have heard of it, the CIBAL project, and it's a brilliant project. And what it's done is, instead of putting interactive whiteboards into every classroom, it's provided a video link, an online video link to every classroom, so that students of English in schools, and primary and secondary, have access to a teacher who's actually in the Philippines or some other English-speaking country. You've seen this, yeah? And it's absolutely marvelous. Or they have laptops, very cheap laptops, which allow them to access these lessons. So they're seeing the teacher and hearing her in real time. It's not recorded, and they're responding, etc. So it's like a large sort of conference call. And it's a wonderful project in the sense that it gets around one of the problems there. What is the problem that's designed to solve it? That the teachers in Uruguay in the rural schools don't speak any English, or very little, or they're not confident enough with their English, so they import a teacher from outside. Now this is fantastic. This seems to me a very, very, very positive use of technology. But it's because there is a problem to be solved, and it's helping solve the problem. What's interesting is that my colleague who's overseeing this project in Uruguay says, interestingly, on our project in Uruguay, the one thing we hear time and time again from the students when we ask them if there's anything we can do to make the experience better, they always say the same thing: we would prefer the teacher in the room with them physically. You know. It's obvious, but they're not unhappy. They're being very well looked after. So, I mean, from a second thing. Okay, so one summarizing piece of research, a mega study that was done recently on educational technology. I'm sorry for the small print, but this was a study done in 2011 called What 40 Years of Research Says About the Impact of Technology on Learning. And it's what's called a second-order meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is an analysis of a whole lot of studies, and a meta-meta-analysis is an analysis of a whole lot of meta-studies. And so this covers over 1,000 studies over 40 years. And they found, this is it. They found what? This is the conclusion of all these studies, education technology. They found that the use of technology in the classroom shows a small to moderate positive effect. So it's not a waste of time. It's not a waste of time. But it's a small to moderate positive effect on student learning as compared to technology-free traditional construction. So there you go. There is a tiny effect, a positive effect. And then it goes on, using technology to support knowledge formation had a greater effect than using technology for the presentation of content. So just presenting content with technology was less effective than using technology to help students use the information. And then they said, this is the great, teacher effectiveness and fidelity of technology and information may have a greater effect on student learning than the nature of the technology. Teacher effectiveness may have a greater effect. So what's the message that we're getting here? That yes, there are positive effects, but that teachers are equally effective, or that the effectiveness of teachers is an important variable. But it's a small to moderate effect, and it doesn't say in this study how this works out in terms of economics. If it's a small to moderate positive effect, I want to know how much did it cost? Yeah, and I want to know if that small to moderate effect could have been achieved by cheaper means, teacher training, for example, as they didn't do in Mexico. And then, here's the cost. In Los Angeles, they decided to do a similar kind of thing. They invested $1 billion in iPads in the system, the educational system there, which immediately the students managed to crack open. I mean, the codes and things, and used for their own nefarious purposes. It was called a massive failure and a massive waste of public money. So those are the costs. So you've got to balance that against this small to moderate positive effect. I think that what we really need to do is concentrate that $1 billion on this one person and make her do what she does already well better, because she can provide input. She can provide her own input through her own voice, or she can find stuff online for the students, or she can guide the students to where to look and outside the classroom. She can provide output. Yeah, or she can set up the conditions in which the students are talking to each other in the classroom and interacting. She can give feedback like nobody else can. She can set up interaction. She can interact herself with the students, as we did yesterday when we did the kind of dogma class, or she can set up interaction between the students. She can provide the motivation like nobody else. Remember the quotation I showed on Friday? That it's the motivational effect of the teacher who walks into the room, who smiles at the students and says, "Good morning, class." That's motivation. And she can provide the data because she's a trained teacher and she knows her grammar and she knows her vocabulary, etc. Or she knows where to look for that data. So it's the teachers that we need to be investing in, not the technology, because the teachers can do all these things and they can save us all a lot of money, and they can do them with charm, grace, humor, and professionalism. And just to remind us that teacher effectiveness may have a greater effect on student learning than the nature of the technological intervention. Now, how are we doing? Thank you.
Any questions?
It was here.
First of all, thank you for your very specific, real-life, oriented vision. question. Are any new standards for digital technology in the market?
Standards?
Yes. I am familiar with IST standards, but I'd like to listen to you. And my second question, what about promotion of learning styles?
Let me answer the second question. Go on, yeah. The second question first, because I think we haven't talked about learning styles, although I've indicated that at various points I think that all learners are different, and so I would never say impose, for example, teaching unplugged on a group of learners without getting their agreement or negotiating the degree to which you would. So that's what I would call their learning preferences, if you like, or disposition, which have a lot to do with their previous learning experience. In terms of technology, I'm not sure, well, I don't know if there's any research on this, whether certain learners are predisposed to technology and others are not. I think there's been a feeling that it's a generational thing rather than a style thing. But even that has been disputed. The fact is, of course, that most learners now, young learners, come to the classroom very, very tech savvy, and that they don't need to be taught to use technology, although they have perhaps a limited range of technological abilities in terms of how they function. It's more for pleasure, entertainment, rather than actual learning. And maybe they need to be taught to how to learn using technology, particularly outside the classroom, so that they use it constructively in ways that are not distracting. In terms of standards, I'm sure there are a long list of standards of how that should be applied in the choice and use of technology, and I know that they must exist in many educational ministries, for example, or in the states. I think new standards, but particularly relevant to technology. I'm sure there are, but I mean, I can't. I don't know chapter and verse. People are constantly writing lists of standards. People are obsessed with standards nowadays. So I'm sure there are. They'd be worth looking for. Any other questions or comments?
Okay. First of all, thank you, because you know why we're refreshed on Sunday. It's you. I think everyone knows that. And a quick remark before I go to the question. Well, actually, in colloquial Armenian, we also use yani. Inch means what? And in Armenian. And we're saying yani inch, meaning what do you mean? I'm sure we took it from the Arabic.
Okay.
But back to the question. So, have you ever taught really advanced students? I mean, super advanced students? And when it seems that they know all of the grammar or the bulk of grammar, and they understand that language, the word stock is endless, how do you motivate them with, because it really seems to be endless. Thank you so much. And I'll pass the microphone to someone else.
But that was with regards to technology or just generally? Generally, yeah. Well, I mean, actually, let me just focus it on technology while we're on the subject, teaching at very advanced students. I'm having on my master's course at the moment, which I'm teaching online, the theme of this week's discussion is the use of corpora. You know what corpora are? Yeah, okay. And it's very interesting, and I've thrown the question out to them and said, what use do you think learners could make of online corpora? Because these teachers, although they're experienced teachers, most of them have never seen one, and they're having trouble getting their heads around and seeing how to use them. So it's all baby steps. And we're all agreed that they would probably not be that really useful or accessible for lower level learners. But at an advanced level, I think teaching very advanced learners some means of using corpora to access information about collocation, for example, about frequency and so on, that could be, again, coming back to learning style, but that could be something that would be worth pursuing because it's there, it's available, it's free, they can do it at home. Whether they do it in the classroom or not, I don't know. And I have to keep reiterating that what I've been talking about here is about classroom use of technology, not outside the classroom use of technology, which is a whole other thing. And I think it's probably that's where it's most successful, is for accessing information about the language, for people communicating with each other using Skype or using online discussions or whatever, and producing recording themselves and so on and so on and so on and so on. But yeah, I mean, I haven't ever taught very, very, very advanced learners, but I can see the challenge. But one thing may be to exploit some of the technological tools for their own self-study, and they can follow the lines of things that they're particularly interested in. Next. Yes.
Thank you very much for two gorgeous sessions. My question is basically related to the first session, and it might sound a bit silly. I just wonder whether fluency varies across genders. Thank you.
Well, that's interesting. Actually, fluency is a very idiosyncratic thing. In the sense that it's not just about genders, it's also about personalities. So we all know people in our first language who are more fluent than others. And what's interesting, actually, is that some studies have done, this is really a little bit depressing, but they compared the fluency of a learner in his or her first language, and then looked to see if there's any correlation in the second language. So in other words, a person who speaks Armenian, let's say, if it's your first language, and you speak it with lots of hesitations, etc., will that carry over when you're speaking English? And yes, it does. So that's it. So if you're disfluent in your first language, you like to be disfluent in your second language. You can't, so that's bad luck. With regard to gender, I mean, everybody says that women are more disposed or better, skilled language-wise, in the sense that they make better use of language. But I mean, I'm not sure if that's a little bit of a myth, and I would love to see some research into that particular issue, but I can't cite any at the moment. It's a good question. Any others? Yes.
Mr. Thornbury, my question refers to the triangle, teacher, student, and materials. What role do you see for the parents?
Well, yes, exactly. So if you imagine the triangle again, you want to situate the triangle in a circle. And then in the circle is what we call the stakeholders. So the stakeholders are the parents, or if it's an adult who's being funded by an organization, to be the funders, or the institution itself, etc. So yes, you cannot ignore, and then that circle is situated in an even bigger circle, which is the society. Yeah, which is situated in the universe. So everything is, it's like matrushkas. This is what they go. It's all, they're all inside each other. But I think, yes, absolutely, the parents. I have a colleague, very, very quickly, I have a colleague in International House Barcelona where I used to teach, and she was a teacher of very, very young learners, like 4, 5, 6-year-olds. And she was very, very, very keen to try out the dogma approach with these children, because she felt it was more appropriate for them than using the books that we had. But how could she do that? She had to get the permission of the director of studies, and very importantly, she had to get the permission of the parents. And she did. She talked to the parents. She said, we're going to supply the children, each child, with a scrapbook. You know what a scrapbook is? Like an empty, what do you call it? Scrapbook. Well, I don't know whether it's a kind of New Zealandism. Anyway. But there would be no course book, yeah? And the reason why, blah, blah, blah. So they get a little printed thing. So she did. And they built up the book using their own stories and pictures of their pets, of dinosaurs, etc. And so by the end of the course, they had this. Isn't that a great idea? And it's kind of obvious, but it's great. But she needed permission. And you're absolutely right. And it's not just the institution's permission. The parents are obviously very, very, very important. Yes, any more? Yes?
My question is related to yesterday's
Technology.
My question is related to yesterday's speech. Do you think a dogma is critical?
Okay, right, okay. How long have you got? Is dogma, the principle, the methodology we're talking about, would you call it a critical methodology in the sense of, is it critical methodologies, what I'm understanding what you mean here, are methodologies which have a kind of social transformative function. So critical pedagogy was first sort of coined as an idea by Paulo Freire in Brazil in the 1960s, not just to make the farm workers literate, but give them ownership of an agency in their society. So there was a strong Marxist agenda, in fact, and that's what started through the idea of critical pedagogy. That pedagogy could do more than just teach people things; it could empower them. Now, dogma never ever set itself up to be a critical pedagogy, but nevertheless, and we've talked about this endlessly amongst ourselves, it does have elements that lend itself to a more critical approach, simply because it tries to subvert the existing architectural paradigm, if you like, of coursebook-led, grammar-led, exam-led, and now technology-led teaching, education. What I haven't talked about today, for example, is the influence of big data on testing. And in fact, that little quote I showed you mentioned assessment, but now we can test learners much better because we have databases where we compare them to every other learner there's ever, and all this kind of thing. So the learner is disappearing as an entity. They're just becoming a figure, an item in a database. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at and queried. So if dogma adds its little grain of sand to that critical discussion, then I'm very grateful. But it was never intended to be society changing. But it's a great question.
And, I wanted to say, if we say that education should be not information, it should be knowledge, and if language is a range of science through which we learn this, the culture of this or that country, can you say that we should do the same with literature? What play has literature in learning language, and how can, if you think so, how can we do it much better? Because we have fascinating English literature, and can give us higher education.
Yeah, and
the same question with other languages like French.
Yeah, no, I mean literature. That's a great question too. And I mean, I think literature traditionally was taught. Well, I mean, it solved one of the problems with the very advanced learners. You gave them literature, and that kind of kept them quiet. But I think the primary reason for teaching literature used to be for cultural transmission. So you taught English and you taught the literature associated with England, or slightly wider Great Britain, or slightly wider the British Commonwealth. So you taught the literature which is written in English because it gave access to the culture. Of course, now this is more problematic nowadays because English no longer belongs in England or in Great Britain or in the British Commonwealth. English has escaped its cage and it's everywhere. And people are writing in it and using it and being literate in it and writing poetry in it, etc., who were never born speaking it. And so where where now is the reason for teaching literature as a kind of cultural item? I don't think it's gone completely, but I think we need to think of literature less as a kind of cultural vehicle than perhaps a way of using language which is really, really interesting in its own self, in its own way, an expressive way of using language. So language is not just about transmitting information. You're absolutely right. It's not about buying tickets on trains. It's not about ordering a meal in a restaurant. It's also about being expressive, interpersonal, creative. And if we lose that side of language, it's a shame. If language is just reduced to being a kind of Esperanto in which we kind of communicate our basic needs, no. So I think literature's got fantastic potential, but less as I say, a cultural vehicle and more as an expressive use of language. But it's difficult. It's not easy to teach. That's why it's sometimes reserved for the higher levels.
One last question.
Actually, I want to thank, on behalf of all Iranian teachers, this was a great opportunity to be there. And I want to refer to a previous question. Can we say that dogma acts as a procedure instead of a method?
Well, yes, you can, because if a procedure is, as I said I think on Friday night, I borrow procedures from other methods, like the community language learning ideas, the one sitting around and recording that's just a procedure or a technique or an activity. My students in Barcelona called it, every time I came in and we did it, they called it karaoke, because it involved recording. That was their name for the procedure. So I sort of picked it out of an existing method and I put it into my own methodology. And I think dogma for most teachers is that. It's what I called yesterday dogma moments. So you can't escape the syllabus, you can't escape the test, you can't escape the parents, you can't escape the headmaster, you can't escape the inspectors, you can't escape the ministry. We have these huge things sitting on top of us. But when the classroom door's closed and nobody's watching, and something happens in the classroom, spontaneously, you can let it run. And you know that it's not wasting anybody's time, because all the research into language acquisition says those little moments when people are really engaged with language, those are the things they remember. So yeah, it's a procedure.
Okay, so I'm so sorry, we have to wrap up. So unfortunately, this is the end of it. So we're done with our 2016. We're done with our 2016 teacher development event. But before we wrap up, I would like to express my gratitude to a number of people. First one is obviously Scott. Thank you so much, Scott, for inspiring me. I hope that you find these sessions meaningful and relevant to your context, and tomorrow when you're going to work, you are going to feel rejuvenated, kind of, and injected a new blood. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for accepting the invitation, and I hope that we will have you in the near future. I also want to thank every single one of you for making this happen, because I think it's you who should get a loud round of applause for making the weekend, week never end, kind of thing. So thank you so much for being so committed to your profession. Thank you for being present and taking responsibility for your professional development. You're great, and that's why this event is great. Thank you so much.